My name is Jason Turner. I was 24 years old when I went through a turning point in my life that started with a simple question from my Aunt Margaret. I hadn't seen her in a few years, and when she came back into my life, it felt like a warm breeze after a long winter. Aunt Margaret had always been my favorite relative growing up. She had a quiet wisdom, the kind that didn't try too hard to be heard but always made you listen. I remember her visits when I was a child, how she brought puzzles, books, and stories from her travels. She was my mom's older sister and was often the one person who actually took time to understand me. But somewhere between high school and adulthood, we'd lost touch. Life had become noisy and fast. My parents divorced during my sophomore year of college, and I moved out shortly after. My dad moved to Florida, my mom downsized into a small apartment in the suburbs, and I floated from one apartment to another, never really settling. I picked up odd jobs, retail, food service, freelance photography gigs. I was chasing a dream of being a professional photographer, but my bank account said otherwise. Most days, I just felt like I was chasing rent. I stopped calling family. Not because I didn't care, but because I didn't know how to explain the chaos of my life. Every conversation felt like I had to pretend things were going well, and they weren't. Then one Saturday afternoon, out of the blue, Aunt Margaret called. I almost didn't answer. I remember staring at the screen, unsure of what to say if she asked me how things were going. But something made me swipe up and answer. Her voice was warm and just as I remembered. She was in town for a few weeks, staying at her old house, the one I used to visit as a kid. She invited me for lunch the next day. I hesitated. I told her I had work. She paused and said, "That's okay, Jason. But if you ever want to talk, my door is open." And then she hung up. That night I didn't sleep well. I thought about how I missed having someone in my life who genuinely cared. I thought about my camera sitting in the corner, untouched for weeks. I thought about how long it had been since I had a home-cooked meal, a real conversation, or just a moment to breathe. So the next morning, I got on a bus and rode across town to Aunt Margaret's house. It looked the same as I remembered: white porch, blue shutters, wind chimes dancing in the breeze. She greeted me with a hug and a smile that made me feel like I was 10 years old again. We sat in the backyard, eating sandwiches and drinking iced tea. The sun was out, the birds were loud, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. After a while, she looked at me and said gently, "So Jason, tell me about your life. How have you really been?" I froze. The words caught in my throat. I wanted to say I'm fine or everything's great, but for some reason, I couldn't lie to her. So I told the truth. I told her about the job I'd just lost at a small coffee shop downtown. I told her about the rent I could barely afford, the passion I'd lost for photography, the loneliness, the anxiety, the fear that I was falling behind in life while everyone else seemed to be moving forward. I told her everything. She didn't interrupt. She didn't offer quick advice or judge me. She just listened, nodding occasionally, her eyes full of understanding. When I was done, she took a deep breath and said, "You've been carrying a lot on your own. But you don't have to. Life's not a race, Jason. And it's never too late to start again." That day turned into a weekend, and the weekend turned into a week. Aunt Margaret invited me to stay in her guest room while I figured things out. At first, I resisted. I didn't want to be a burden. But she insisted. "This house has been quiet for too long," she said. "It would be nice to have some life in it again." So I stayed. In the quiet comfort of her home, I began to heal. Aunt Margaret had a way of making each day feel intentional. We cooked together, went for walks, watched old movies, and talked about everything. She shared stories from her own youth, how she too once felt lost after college. She told me how she found her calling later in life, working in non-profit organizations and traveling the world to help people. She reminded me that every journey is different and that success doesn't look the same for everyone. One evening, as we sat on the porch, I told her I hadn't picked up my camera in months. She smiled and said, "Then tomorrow, we go shooting." The next day, we drove to a nearby lake. She brought a picnic, and I brought my camera. I remember the way the light hit the water, how the trees cast long shadows across the path. For the first time in what felt like forever, I looked through the lens and saw beauty again. I snapped photos for hours, letting my instincts guide me. That night, I edited the pictures on her computer. She looked over my shoulder and said, "These are incredible, Jason. You still have the eye." Her words meant more than she knew. They weren't just compliments, they were a reminder that my passion was still alive. It had just been buried under the weight of life. Over the next few weeks, I began to rebuild. I updated my photography portfolio, started reaching out to local clients, and applied for a few part-time jobs to help stay afloat. Aunt Margaret helped me set up a small workspace in her garage, where I could shoot portraits and still-life compositions. She even asked her friends if they needed photos for their businesses or family events. Slowly but surely, the bookings started to come in. More importantly, I started to believe in myself again. I realized that sometimes, we need someone to ask us the hard questions, not to interrogate us, but to remind us that we matter, that our stories are worth telling, even when they're messy. Aunt Margaret didn't fix my life, but she helped me remember who I was. A few months later, I moved into a small apartment not too far from her house. I still visited her every week. We'd have Sunday lunches and talk about our goals, our memories, and sometimes just laugh at nothing. My business grew. I started photographing weddings, small business promotions, and even did a few travel shoots for magazines. The boy who felt like a failure had become a man with a purpose. One day, while going through old photo albums, Aunt Margaret handed me a picture of us from when I was 9. We were in the same backyard, with lemonade in hand and summer smiles. She said, "You've always been special, Jason." I knew it then, and I know it now. That photo now sits on my desk, next to my camera and a notebook where I jot down future ideas. It reminds me of where I came from, how far I've come, and how one simple question from someone who cares can change everything. Tell me about your life. That's all it took. Now, whenever I meet someone who's struggling or seems lost, I try to remember what Aunt Margaret did for me. I ask them, sincerely, how they're doing. I listen. Because sometimes, that's all we need to be seen, to be heard, and to be reminded that it's okay not to have it all figured out. Life isn't a straight road. It twists, it turns, and sometimes it crashes. But with the right people beside us, we find our way.